What's good, y'all? Today I'm going to be teaching you guys how to make a designer backpack with this step-by-step tutorial. These bags are great for daily use for carrying your essentials, and they're a lot of fun to make. I've made a couple of these before, and I've had a lot of people that have been asking for the backpack pattern, so I figured it was finally time to get you guys the pattern and the tutorial for these backpacks. The link to the pattern is below. Once you get it, it'll be emailed to you as a PDF that you can print off right at home, and then it also comes with some extra notes, guides, references, and some chances to win some free things. Then this video will give you the extra info you need, as well as a step-by-step tutorial to help you make this bag come to life. I'll be doing some extra things throughout this video to customize this bag, but the focus of this video is going to be on making this bag in its simplest form. I would say this pattern and bag are in the intermediate range, but at the end of this video, I will go over some things that can help make this more beginner friendly. I hope you guys are as excited as I am. I've been waiting for the perfect time to make another one of these bags, so let's get to it. All you're gonna need is the fabric of your choice, the lining fabric of your choice, foam, interfacing, heavyweight backing, the pattern, a number 10 zipper that's at least 18 inches long, 2 1-inch rectangle rings and 2 1-inch sliders, then glue, tape, and rivets are optional but recommended. You'll start by printing the pattern at 100% scale on 8.5 by 11-inch paper. Then you'll want to check this little test box to make sure it printed properly. You can start cutting out the pattern now, being as precise as possible. I recommend using craft scissors and not your fabric scissors. Once the pieces are cut, you can start matching the numbered triangles together and taping the pieces together to create your full pieces. There's also a couple of pieces that say cut on fold, and you can choose whether to cut those pieces on the fold, or you can print them twice, mirror the two, and then tape them together to create the full piece. You can start cutting everything out now. Each pattern piece will tell you how many pieces to cut from each fabric. Take your time and get as clean of cuts as possible. I also recommend marking the middle of all of your pieces as you cut them out. This is gonna help later on. Now that everything is cut, we can start the prep work. I'll start with the heavyweight backing, which as you can see is smaller than its respective piece because you don't wanna sew it into the seam. So you'll mark a 1/2 inch in on all of your pieces on the wrong side of the fabric, and your heavyweight backing should line up in that area perfectly, and then you can go ahead and fuse all of the backing in place. Since you won't be sewing the backing into the seam, you want to add a layer of protection to hold it in place. So you'll add the interfacing on top, which will sandwich the backing in and keep it from moving. So you can go ahead and fuse the interfacing on. Make sure to go around the edges to really seal it in. Once that's done, you should have your backing and interfacing on your front, middle, and bottom pieces, and foam and interfacing on your back piece. Now that the backing is done, if you want to add purse feet, I have some markings for them that you can use to get those in place. Moving on, we're going to prep the straps. So on the strap connector pieces, I'll mark a 1/2 inch from the edge on both sides. And on the straps, I'll mark a 1/2 inch from the edge on just one side. And both of these are on the wrong side of the fabric. Then I'll spread some glue within those areas and fold the edges to their respective lines. This will help make everything super precise and it will prevent raw edges. On the strap connector pieces, you can go ahead and mark the middle the long way now and get some glue on the entire wrong side. Then fold one edge into the middle line and fold the other edge in so that they meet in the middle. For the straps, I'll also mark the middle the long way on both pieces, and I'll also mark 3.5 inches from the finished edge on the wrong side. I'll spread some glue within that lower area. Then, just like before, I'll fold one side into the middle and fold the other side in so that they meet in the middle. Now on the rest of the strap that isn't glued, you'll just iron both sides to the middle. Then again, I'll mark 3.5 inches from the finished edge on the wrong side. I'll spread some glue within that lower area and I'll fold the strap in half, making sure all the edges match up perfectly. Then, just like before, I'll iron the rest of the strap in half as well. You can move on to the triangles now. I'll start by marking the middle of the triangle, and I'll mark a 1/2 inch from the edge on all 3 sides. The heavyweight backing pieces should fit perfectly in those areas with a small gap between them in the middle. Once I fuse those in place, I'll mark 7/8 of an inch up from the lower edge, and I'll glue that area and fold the edge up to that line. Once you've done that, your triangles are done and you can set them aside for now. Now for the back bar, I'll mark 3/8 of an inch in from the top and bottom edges, and I'll mark a 1/2 inch in on both sides. The heavyweight backing should fit perfectly in that area. Then once I fuse the backing in place, I'll mark 3/4 of an inch from the top and bottom edge, and I'll glue those edges down to their respective lines. Once that's done, I should have 2 strap connector pieces, 2 straps, 2 triangles, and 1 back bar that are all prepped. You also need to make a handle. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go through the full process of how I make my rolled handles, but if you don't know how, I have a full step-by-step tutorial that I'll link below. Since this handle will be sewn into the back bar though, you don't need to have finished edges on the bottom, and the pinch point should be 1 1/4 inch up on each side. Now for the piping, you'll need to cut a strip of fabric that's 1 3/8 of an inch wide and at least 31 inches long, and you'll cut a piece of 1/8 inch cord that's the same length. For the piping, you'll need a presser foot that can get right up next to the cord because that's what's going to give you your 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. So on the same note, if you use a different size cord, you'll need to adjust the width of the fabric strip you cut as well so that your seam allowance stays at 3/8 of an inch. So I'll go ahead and make the piping cord, then I'll cut 1/4 inch slits across the edge, and this will allow it to curve nicely around the corners. Now that everything is prepped, we're ready to start sewing, but before we get into that, I have a few notes I want to give y'all. First off, I'm going to be sewing all the seams with a 3mm stitch length and all of the top stitching with a 4mm stitch length. Second, everything is going to be done with a 3/8 inch seam allowance with the exception of the shoulder straps. That's going to be a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And finally, I'm going to be using a Tex 80 cotton wrapped polycore thread and a Tex 80 bonded nylon thread. I'm able to do this because I have an industrial machine. If you're sewing on a domestic machine, just use what thread you can. It's still gonna come out beautifully. I'll start by finishing my back pieces. So I'm gonna mark 1/8 of an inch from the edge on the right side of both strap connector pieces. And I'll do the same on the finished edge of both strap pieces, but not the raw edge. Starting with the strap, I'll sew 1/8 of an inch from the edge. Starting at my mark I just made, and I'll sew all the way to the end. Then I'll go on the other side and I'll start all the way at the end once again and sew all the way back to my mark I made. On the strap connector pieces, I'll start at one mark and sew 1/8 of an inch from the edge all the way to the other mark. Then I'll go ahead, flip it around, and do the same thing on the other side. Now I'm gonna make the shoulder straps. I'll start by marking 1 3/4 of an inch up from the bottom edge on the wrong side of all 4 pieces. I'll use these lines to get the foam in place shortly. Then I can take 2 of the pieces and clip them right sides together. Then I'll go ahead and sew starting at the top on one side. I'll sew all the way down, turning at the first corner, sewing the rest of the way down, turning and sewing across, then turning and sewing all the way back up, leaving the top open so I can turn it. Then I'll trim these bottom corners so that they turn nicely. Just make sure not to get too close to the stitching. Now you'll need to cut 4 pieces of foam that are 1 5/8 of an inch wide and at least 19 inches long. You'll line one end of the foam strip up with the line you drew out earlier, and you'll fuse it in place, making sure it stays even between the stitching on both sides. There should be some extra that hangs off the end. This is gonna help make it easier to turn, and then you can trim that excess later. Then you'll flip the strap over and go ahead and do the exact same thing to the other side and to the other strap. Once you've done that to both straps, you can start flipping them right side out. There's various tools that you can buy to help with this, but I just do it by hand. It is a bit tedious and potentially even a bit tricky your first time, but just do what you gotta do. Go ahead, get it flipped through. Once it's flipped, I'm gonna roll out these bottom corners to get them pushed out the best I can, but they don't need to be perfect since they'll be covered up anyways. Now I'll iron it quick and make sure the seams are even on both sides. Then I can go ahead and mark the middle of the strap. I'll be using this as a sewing guide, so I'll only do this on the top side. Once that's marked, I'll sew down the middle following that line. This will help hold the foam in place, and then once I've sewn that, I can trim that excess foam on top. Now I'll mark out where the strap connectors will go, so I'll draw a line 1 1/2 inches up from the bottom edge, and I'll mark 1/2 inch from the middle in both directions, and I'll do this on both sides of the strap and for both straps. Then on the wrong side of the strap connectors, I'll find the middle and mark 1/2 inch in each direction from there. The rectangle ring will sit in the middle on the wrong side, and the strap connector will go in the areas I marked out on both sides of the shoulder strap. And since I don't want to get glue on the hardware, I'll only glue the outer areas on the strap connector, not in the middle area. So I'll get some glue in those areas, then I'll stick one side of the strap connector in place in the areas I marked out. I'll get the rectangle ring on, and then I'll stick the other side in place. The goal is to get them perfectly even on both sides. I can sew across the top 1/8 of an inch from the edge now. I'll start where my stitching stopped earlier, and I'll sew across to where the stitching stopped on the other side. Then I'll turn, I'll sew back, and finish with a back stitch. The goal is to get the stitching to line up on both sides. I'm also gonna add 2 rivets centered in this area. I'd recommend doing at least 1 rivet, or if nothing else, adding another row of stitching on the bottom. I'm gonna finish the straps now. So on the wrong side, I'll mark 3¼ inch from the finished edge. This line is where the edge will be folded to. Now with the strap facing wrong side up, I'll go through the bottom of the slider and back through the top, and I'll line the edge up with the line I just marked out. Then I'll get a little bit of glue on the wrong side and I'll glue that in place, matching the edge to the line. Similar to before, I'll sew across from where the stitching ends on one side to where the stitching ends on the other side. So I'll just sew 1/8 inch from the edge, turning when I get to the other side, then coming back and finishing with the back stitch. I'm gonna just add 1 rivet here and I'll do it centered 1/2 inch below the line I just stitched. Slow this part down if needed. I'm gonna take 1 shoulder strap with the right side facing up, and I'll take 1 strap with the wrong side facing up. Then I'll go through the back of the rectangle ring, come through the front and go down through the top of the slider, then again through the bottom. This is what will make it adjustable, and once it's pulled through, it should end with the shoulder strap and adjustable strap both right side up. The left side will look like this, and the right side will be the opposite and look like this. You could also sew across here and flip it down, but I prefer to just glue it instead. So I'll glue the strap in place in the corner with the bottom edge lined up with the bottom folded edge of the triangle piece. Then I'll sew 1/8 inch from the edge. When I get about 1/8 inch from the edge again, I'll do a couple stitches down, turn, and sew all the way back across 3/8 inch from the edge. I'm almost ready to set the back bar up now, but first I'm gonna mark 1/2 inch down from the top edge, and I'll also mark 7/8 inch from the middle in both directions. The inner edges of the shoulder straps will line up with these lines, and the bottom edge will match with the first line I drew. So I'll go ahead and glue those in place with the wrong sides together, so that when the shoulder straps flop over, they're facing right side up. I'm gonna mark 1¼ inch from the middle in both directions, and I'll tape my handles in place. The inner edges match with those marks, and the lower edges are matched up with the lower edges of the shoulder straps. I'll get some tape on the top and bottom, and the bar is ready to go. Before I can get the bar in place though, I'll need to mark 1¾ inch down from the very top of the back piece, and I'll mark 3¾ inch down as well. I can get the bar in place between those lines, and it should match up perfectly on the edges too. I can sew the bar on, so I'll sew from the bottom first, starting 1/8 inch from the edge and sewing all the way across. I can do the same for the top. The top has some pretty bulky areas. I also like to hammer those bulky areas down a bit before sewing to reduce that bulk. Regardless, just go ahead and go slow with this part. If you want to increase the durability of the handles and straps, you could also add a second row of stitching. You could add rivets, or what I'm going to do is double stitch this top row. I'll sew across it again, hitting all the same holes I did the first time. So I can get my lining on, I'll match the back lining piece to the back base piece, wrong sides together, then I'll clip that in place and I'll go ahead and baste it on, sewing all the way around. Now I'll use these lower marks on my back pattern piece, and I'll match the bottom point of the triangle up with that line on both sides of the back. I'll baste the triangles in place. Once you've done that, the back should be done and you're ready to move on. To get the lining on the front as well, so same thing, I'll match the pieces wrong sides together, I'll clip the lining in place, and then I'll baste it on, once again sewing all the way around. And I can do the same for the bottom piece, so I'll match the lining with the base piece wrong sides together, I'll clip them together and sew all the way around the bottom. And get the piping on now. I'll take my piping cord and start with one end just a bit before the middle mark on either side, and start clipping it in place all the way around, making sure the edge of the piping stays in line with the edge of the base piece, especially as I go around the curves. I'm back to where I started. I'll trim the cord so that it matches with the other end, then I'll trim some of the excess fabric off as needed, fold that edge back so there's no exposed raw edge, and then I'll clip it in place. I also like to try to match it up so that this edge here is in the exact same spot as my middle mark. So I can go ahead and baste my piping on, so I'll sew all the way around, making sure the edge of the piping stays in line with the edge of the base as I sew. You can see with a presser foot that gets right up next to the cord, I'll have my 3/8 inch seam allowance. You won't be able to see the cord while you sew, but you will be able to feel it. Now I'm going to make my middle strip. I'm using a number 10 zipper. If you use a different size zipper, you'll need to adjust the widths of some of the other middle pieces accordingly. I also prefer to set up my own zippers, so I'll just sew the zipper tape in for now, then I'll add the sliders and stops after. Regardless, the zipper needs to be at least 18 inches long in the end. You could use a preset zipper that's already 18 inches, or start with zipper tape that's longer like I'm doing. gonna start with the back middle strip piece, which is the bigger one, and I'll match the shorter side of that right sides together with the zipper. Then on the bottom, I'll match the same edge of the lining up, so the zipper is sandwiched between. This way, once it's sewn and turned, there's a clean finish on both sides. So I'll go ahead and sew that with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance all the way from one end to the other. Then I'm gonna repeat that process on the other side, except I'll take the front zipper piece, and this time I'll match the longer edge up, and I'll match it in line with my edge I just sewed on. And again, I'll match the lining on the back side and sew it all the way across 3/8 of an inch. Once it's sewn and turned, it should look something like this with a clean finish on both sides. Then I can top stitch both halves along the zipper. So I'll top stitch 1/8 of an inch from the edge on both sides, and this stitching should go through the top and lining evenly. It should look like this now with no exposed edges on either side. I finished setting up my zipper too. Just remember, you need at least 3/8 of an inch from the end of the zipper stop to the edge of the fabric on both sides for your seam allowance. I'm also using 2 zipper heads so that the bag can be open and closed from both sides, but this is by no means required. Now I can take my bottom middle strip pieces and I'll match the top edge with the lower edge of the middle strip on both sides with the right sides together, and just like before, I'll match the respective lining pieces on the back with the wrong sides together. Again, this way once it's sewn, there's a clean finish on both sides. I'll sew both sides with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then I can go ahead, flip it over, and top stitch across 1/8 of an inch from the edge. My middle strip should look something like this now with a clean finish on all the seams. I'm gonna do the side pockets now. There's a couple ways that you can do them. You could fold the top piece down twice and top stitch it like you do with a back pocket on jeans, or what I'm gonna do is trim a 1/2 inch off of the top of the pocket, then sew a lining piece right sides together with that piece with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, then I'll flip it over and top stitch it. Either way, the top of the pocket should end up being 1 inch down from where the top of the pattern piece currently is. Then once the pocket is done, I'll baste it on the middle strip, so I'll match the bottom edges. The top of the side pocket is slightly wider than the base of the middle strip. This will make it stick out just a little bit so that it's accessible and you can get your hand in and out of it. So I'll match the bottoms and sides up, then I can baste it in place, sewing just those 3 sides. Now I'll cut 1/4 inch slits on both sides of the zipper strip. This will allow it to spread around the curves of the front and back piece. Once I've done that, the middle strip is done and it should look something like this. This is completely optional. In fact, it's the first time I've even added it, but if you want to add a bit of structure to the front of the bag, you can add piping to the front panel. You'll need to cut a piece of fabric that's 1 3/8 of an inch wide and at least 27 inches long. You also don't want to sew the piping into the bottom seam, so you'd want it to end at least 5/8 of an inch or so above the bottom edge on both sides. You can just pull the ends off to the side so there's no raw edge. Same as I mentioned before, you will need a piping foot if you want to do this, but like I said, this is by no means required. You don't have to do the piping here. Regardless, I'm going to match the middle strip to the front now, so I'll match my middle marks on both pieces right sides together, and I'll start spreading the middle strip around the curve, matching the bottom on both sides and then everything in between. You can sew it on now with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Just take your time and go slow. Make sure the edges stay matched up as you sew, especially around the curve, and make sure nothing's getting pinched. I'm gonna add the binding tape to this seam now. You can use store-bought binding tape or you can make your own. Regardless, you'll want a few strips that are 1 inch wide and at least 31 inches long. The binding tape will cover the seam so that there's no exposed raw edges. So I'll start clipping the binding tape in place. I'll start a bit before the bottom edge and start working it around, making sure it's even on both sides. Then I want it to go a little bit past the bottom edge on the other side as well, and I'll trim the excess of both sides once it's sewn. I'll sew it on now, sewing 1/8 of an inch from the lower edge of the binding tape. Just take your time and make sure everything stays even on both sides as you sew. Now I can repeat all that for the back piece, except I'm not using piping on the back, so I'll match the middle marks again as well as the bottoms, and I'll clip it in place all the way around. Once again, I'll sew it with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Take your time and make sure everything stays even. The back is a bit trickier than the front, but it's not bad at all if you go slow. Then once again, I'll clip the binding tape in place all the way around, making sure it stays even on both sides. Then I'll sew it 1/8 of an inch from the lower edge, making sure nothing shifts as I sew around the curve. Before I sew the bottom on, I like to baste the seams the correct direction, so I sew those down so the seam allowance faces in towards the middle strip on both sides. Then I'm going to gently hammer the lower parts of those seams down. This compresses the fabric and reduces bulk. It's gonna make it easier to sew. Then finally, I'll cut 1/4 inch slits around the bottom edge to help it curve around the corners of the bottom piece. And once that's done, I can start clipping the bottom piece in place. So I'll match the middles on each side and I'll spread the bottom edge around the curves of the bottom piece and I'll clip all that in place. Now I can sew the bottom on. So since I'm using piping, I'll use my piping foot and I'll keep it pressed tight against the cord to keep my 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Go really slow with the bottom to make sure nothing shifts or pinches, especially as you go around the corners. Now, similar to what I did before, I'll clip the binding tape all the way around the seam until I get back to where I started. Make sure it's even on both sides, especially around the curves, and I can go ahead, sew that on 1/8 of an inch from the lower edge, making sure nothing shifts on me. Now all that's left to do is flip the bag right side out, so I'll start pushing everything through. If you used heavyweight backing like me, this part is tedious and you do have to be a bit forceful, but as long as you stitched everything well, nothing is gonna bust open, so just do what you gotta do, get it flipped. Once it's flipped, it'll still be a bit deformed, so just go around, work the seams out, make sure all the seams are facing the correct way. You should spend at least 5 to 10 minutes just shaping everything to ensure everything looks right and is sitting how it should. Once you're done shaping it, the bag is done. I'm super happy with how it came out. It's a super beautiful and functional bag, and it was a great way to use some upcycled materials. I did some extra things like the distressing and hand stitching. I also added a zipper pocket and a slip pocket on the lining as well. I think that this is a super functional bag and I'm looking forward to somebody getting a lifetime of use out of it. Before you go, I'm gonna teach you a couple more things that'll maybe make this bag a bit more beginner friendly, and I'm gonna show you the bag on body to help give you a size reference. This area here on the back bar can get a bit bulky, and I gave some tips earlier to help with that, like hammering it down. However, if you're on a domestic machine, I can't say for certain whether your machine will be able to handle it or not because I haven't tried it myself. So if you're worried about it and want to reduce some bulk, you can always remove the heavyweight backing from the back bar to reduce it a little bit, or you could remove one of the layers of foam from the shoulder pads as well, and that would help reduce bulk even further. Same with these triangles down here. If you're worried your machine won't be able to sew through the strap and both layers of the heavyweight backing, you could always remove one or both of the pieces of heavyweight backing in that triangle. And while we're on the topic of heavyweight backing, I like adding it because I think it helps structure the bag, it makes it look really nice and it keeps its shape. However, since it is stiffer, it can make things a bit trickier in multiple different times throughout making the bag. So if you're not comfortable doing the heavyweight backing, you can skip that, or you could add some extra interfacing instead. The nice thing with this style of bag is it doesn't necessarily need to be super structured. It's really just a design choice. So if you're worried about that, feel free to skip it or just adjust how you do it. I also use piping to help add some structure around the bottom here and around the front panel. However, as I mentioned before, you do need a presser foot that can get up right next to the piping cord. So if you don't have a presser foot like that, or if you're just not comfortable doing the piping, you can always skip it and it'll be completely fine. But on the flip side, you could also use store-bought piping to make it even easier. And in general, I promise, the piping is not as difficult as it may seem. This is what the bag looks like on body. For reference, I'm 6'4", and this is the straps at their longest length. And then here they are at their shortest length. I think this bag turned out lovely. It's a super clean and functional bag that's really well made, and I'm super excited for someone to get a lifetime of use out of it. I mean it when I say this pattern has so much potential for customization. The options really are endless. This backpack is about 12 inches tall, 9.5 inches wide, and 5 inches deep. I do have a bigger version of the same backpack, and I have that pattern on my website as well. You would follow the exact same tutorial. It's all the same, just a bigger size. I hope this tutorial was easy to follow. I know that this pattern and tutorial do have their fair share of intricacies, so feel free to drop questions in the comments and I'll do my best to help out. If you want to see some of my other work, I'm also on Instagram and TikTok. And if you want more tutorials, make sure to subscribe here. I'm going to be posting at least once a month, hopefully more. And I'm also going to be doing giveaways for people that purchase my patterns and people that even just comment and subscribe on here. Have fun making your backpack. I promise the end result is going to be worth the time that goes into it. This bag has so much potential for customization, so get creative with it, have fun. I can't wait to see what y'all make. I love y'all.